Welcome to Planetary Trace and Go. This is the show where we look at contact tracing technology around the world. We examine what's hot, what's working, and what needs a lot of work. So today we're going to start with a live studio discussion. I'm going to bring in people from New Zealand, Australia, and America. Welcome, my name's Simon Small. Over the last 5 weeks, we've found the need to really look at contact technology because there's so many options and there's so many key issues that need to be explored. With me now, I just want to introduce to you Priya Samra. Welcome, Priya.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to see you here. In
like all of your Facebook contacts, your phone contacts, the people that you meet in your day-to-day life we're part of this global whole. So, the idea, it can be an object and it can also be a person who doesn't know that they're asymptomatic or they're about to come down with this virus and may spread it to other people because they came into contact. And these are kind of the simplest way to think about it is like, you could have just been at the same grocery store aisle and somebody sneezed, and that person had just met somebody who got off the plane from a country where there was a breakout of the virus.
Right.
And so it's super important for all of us to understand this because the only universal that we have is our health, is what I'm realizing. And being in New Zealand, I'm actually really impressed by how the level of care that people have taken in sheltering in place and helping vulnerable populations and taking care of one another. And I'm just really impressed upon being here. Vacation plan 6 months ago turned into a lockdown in New Zealand, and I've learned quite a bit just being here from you and other Kiwis.
Yeah, so perhaps worth saying that one of the reasons this show's come about is because during the lockdown here, I've been talking with you a lot about this and also with John. Let's bring John in. John, you've sort of lived between New Zealand and California all your life, using technology. And
well, first of all, it's great to be here today, Simon. It's really amazing to drop in from Moonshot Studio. And I think the big picture idea I kind of want to explore today is contact tracing is very important because we already know that manual contact tracing, and that's where basically you have someone who's calling, going through every contact you had and doing a bunch of forensic style interviews. We know that that works, and that's what we've done in previous pandemics and previous times. What we're looking at today is basically what that means in the age of digital media and digital apps. Everyone has a phone, everyone has other types of devices that they're connected with. How can we use those to our advantage? And the corollary there is, what is actually real security? What is real efficacy? And what is PR or security theater? Because at the end of the day, much like we've talked about masks and PPE, it turns out if you're a trained health professional or if you know how to wear a mask, how to make sure that it's sealed right, how to not touch your face in the process, a mask is very safe and effective PPE. But if you're just going out and doing the same business as usual and you have a mask on and you don't know how to use it, all of a sudden it gives you a false sense of security. So the thing we've been talking about kind of for the last month and a half is what is real, what is effective, and also what can we expect from digital apps. At the end of the day, it's great to have technology like Bluetooth or anything else that helps us augment manual contact tracing. But if we're giving the population a false sense of security, if we're letting people think that they're safe when they're not, then we get back to the really day zero of lockdown and we have to start all over again. So I think one of the important things to discuss today is what is real, what is effective, and what at the end of the day is going to make us feel better, but not actually help us get out of this stasis that we're in.
Great. And I've got the slide up that we worked on. So these are some of the things that you talked about. Just take us through briefly at a high, because we're going to basically for anyone listening in, these are the kind of conversations that we've been having, not quite on a daily basis, but several times a week during lockdown, Priya and John and I. And this show is kind of like what we would like to watch. so it's more The Wire than it is Magnum PI. We're gonna assume that you know a reasonable amount. It's not a high level show. It's getting into the weeds and actually being a bit of a reference point and putting stuff on public record so that we can say, well, in the first show we actually covered that, and this is what we discovered about that from someone who's actually using that application in Australia. So don't believe everything you read. So take us through these items, John. You've already talked about a few, but
absolutely. I'll be kind of brief on a couple of these. Obviously, privacy is a huge concern. We want to make sure any type of solution that gets deployed, both in New Zealand and around the world, respects individual privacy, because otherwise we go down a path where it's a very slippery slope towards being tracked or traced places that we haven't opted in or outside of the COVID crisis. So that kind of dovetails into efficacy, because obviously the more data we have on a user, the less private your actions are, the more effective a solution could be. But we really want to talk through what the happy medium is that respects personal privacy while still being effective. In those kind of lights, the technology aspect is just basically saying how much can we depend on technology? How much does something like Bluetooth or GPS or other proximity sensors actually help us and enable us to do this better? And how much, moving on to the next point, is it all just security theater? At the end of the day, there's a lot of things that can make us safer as a society, but there's also things that just make us feel safer. And we want to steer away from the things that make us feel safe in a way that doesn't actually protect us or aid manual contact tracing or really aid us as a community. When we look at all these kind of combined, there are various things like right now, the proposal by Apple and Google for contact tracing technology pretty much completely lacks location. So it does capture who contacts who, but one question that we probably should delve into is how much does location matter? Because I personally am of the approach that location is very important, because as Priya mentioned earlier, if you go to a bar or a supermarket or a place of business, depending on the level that we're currently at, if someone coughs or contaminates a surface, COVID can survive for anywhere between 20 and 60 hours, depending on what type of surface that is. So we want to be mindful about the fact that even a good contact tracing app doesn't just trace your contacts, but also traces where you might have been where there are clusters. The rest of the points kind of lead from there. Simplicity is important, because if everyone can't use this app easily and effectively, then there's going to be large portions of the population that either don't download it, don't use it, or opt to opt out. Interoperability, equally important, because if you have an Android or an Android device or an Apple device or Samsung, whatever else, like basically all of these platforms need to communicate in a way that is consistent and allows the app ecosystem to possibly fragment. But like if I go to, let's say we're out of this level 3, go to level 2 or level 1, if I go to Australia, it would still be nice for me to trace my contacts and have a high sense of efficacy in the fact that all of my contacts are being traced, and if I later come down with symptoms, I can notify the people that matter. Finally, like display of confidence is really another way of saying PR. We want our technology to give us confidence, but we don't want our technology to just be a display of confidence. We want to actually have it be real, effective solutions that make it easier for us to get back to a semblance of normality.
Awesome, thank you. So if there's nothing else from you both, I'm going to bring in our first guest from over the seas, Perth. It's Brian Dunstan. I'm going to call you a concerned citizen, Brian. And tell us, Brian, about, well, you and I actually were speaking last week in a Zoom call, and You didn't realize it, but when I joined the call, you were launching into a discussion about contact tracing and the app in Australia, and it was music to my ears because I thought, well, maybe I can have you come on this show. So,
yeah, well, thanks for inviting me, Simon. It's a pleasure.
You're welcome.
It has been an interesting thing here in Australia. I've had a few surprises with the way that it's unfolding. I should say my background is in health informatics. So professionally, I'm concerned with collecting data and analysing data, particularly around health and medical records. When the government announced that it was going to put this tracing app, which they're calling COVID Safe, out, I thought it was a wonderful idea, and I still do think it's a pretty good idea. But there's been a couple of surprising things about it. Firstly, the uptake has been pretty strong. Here in Australia, I believe we've got about 18 million smartphones in use. And within the first few hours, there were over 1 million downloads of the app, which was looking pretty good. It's been out now for 8 days, and the last I heard, there were 4 million downloads. I think the government's looking for at least 10 million downloads. And I've been promoting it to all my social contacts and people that I've been talking to. And I've been a little surprised by some of the resistance points that I've met. They've generally been around privacy, which is interesting, I think, because we give away our privacy in so many ways. This app, and the government has been very strong on this, is very limited in the information that it collects. It uses no GPS location information. It's only using Bluetooth. No data is shared with anybody unless you get tested positive. And if you are tested positive, then you go into your app and you hit a button, and then it uploads to the Department of Health the mobile phone numbers of people that you have been in proximity with, as detected by Bluetooth, for more than 15 minutes. So passing somebody in the street, that won't count. It's only if you're with somebody for a prolonged period of time. And particularly with our social distancing and the sort of reduced movement these days, I think that'd be a fairly short list. And what's more, the list gets culled when a contact is 21 days old. It gets removed from your list. It's held in an encrypted form on your phone, so I can't access it. The government has even passed legislation that says this information that's collected will only ever be used and can only ever be used for this contact tracing for COVID-19. So you couldn't really put up many more safety barriers around privacy. And yet, educated, intelligent people that I talk to are sometimes saying to me, well, I'm not going to install it because I don't trust that it's private. I don't trust, essentially they're saying they don't trust the government. And yet, if I ask them, well, do you use Google Maps? You know, that traces your movements. While you're using the navigator, it knows. It's far more intrusive than what this particular app is doing. Or do you use store loyalty cards? You know, when I go and shop, I give away the information about where I'm shopping and what I'm buying. And those things don't really have the same measure of benefit as effective contact tracing. Now, John, I think you said the manual contact tracing works. Well, it sort of does. But many people, if we ask them, who's everybody, give me a list of everybody you've contacted in the last 21 days or that you've been near. Well, in some situations, I wouldn't know the people. If I've been in a gathering, if I've been riding on a train, let's say I might have been on a train for half an hour, the app with Bluetooth will pick up some of those contacts and I have no idea who they are. So there are cases in which the contact tracing won't actually work manually, where you do need some sort of technology. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity to help contain the virus. I also think that, with our lockdowns, and in Australia and in New Zealand, we've been pretty effective with reducing, coming close to eliminating the virus, which is great. But even if we keep our borders up, it's unrealistic to expect that nobody will ever get in. There'll be no vector for the virus coming into Australia or New Zealand. It's going to happen, and there will be outbreaks. And if we want to keep our economy and our lifestyle going, the key, it seems to me, is being able to effectively address those outbreaks when they occur, because they will occur. And
Okay.
it all comes down to contact tracing then.
Yeah. So let's just talk a little bit about the technology that's used, and just go straight into that level of detail. John, you got any questions for Brian about that, or anything you want to say about the technology in Australia?
I mean, mostly I haven't had a chance to review the source code to the Australian solution. I'm not sure if it's actually been open sourced yet, but there was a really, really great teardown that was walking through just the basics of how it works, and it lines up a lot with what you just said, Brian. Thank you for walking us through that. I think the one thing that I was curious about, and the one thing I haven't quite been able to dig into yet, is most of the contact tracing solutions use a random identifier that changes basically every 15 minutes, and your phone is scanning for whether or not it sees other random identifiers nearby. I'm a little bit unclear how they get the phone number of the person from the random identifier, or maybe the Australian solution isn't using a random identifier.
Yeah, I was a little surprised when I heard that it was actually the phone number that was being used. I had assumed that there will be some sort of randomized identifier. I haven't seen the source code. I believe that some parts of it have been released, and the government has said they're waiting for advice from the Australian Signals Directorate about what parts are safe to release. But beyond that, the only thing I know about the software itself is that it was based on what was used in Singapore, but it's obviously been heavily Australianized and customized.
Got it. And I guess that is my one hesitation that I want to look into a little bit more, is if they're just broadcasting the actual phone number of the person from Bluetooth. That seems like something that could potentially be abused in the future, but also I don't want to discourage people from using contact tracing apps. I think it is important to get high penetration of the population before they're effective. The one thing I really both like and think is challenging about the Apple and Google solutions, which are hopefully going to be released soon, they haven't been released yet, are that they do very much preserve privacy in a way where strong encryption is used to make sure there's no central source of phone numbers. And I think that's one thing that we should try to make sure we push on all parties involved and anyone coming up with a solution, that at the end of the day, it doesn't take a lot of technology resources to spy on someone's Bluetooth identifier. And the last thing we want to see is for these technologies to start to bleed out and have sensors at airports or bus terminals or wherever else that are tracking you without your explicit opt-in.
Yeah, and if I could hop in here, definitely there have been 300 experts who said if privacy is not maintained, that contact tracing just won't work because people will find ways around it. So we really need people to actually believe in the technologies that they're using, that they're not going to be employed for that. At the same time, we live in a time where we're extremely visible on the internet. We have social media. We have many methods of figuring out who somebody is. Like, you're trying to figure out who patient zero is. But what we've seen is that this affects the whole world. So there has to be a balance there. And it's up to experts and technologists to describe that and ensure that this is enshrined at the center of this type of technology.
Yeah, let's come back to this. Well, just on the phone number and all of that, there was a podcast that featured a Guardian journalist who said that it was a guy called Joshua Taylor, seemed pretty switched on. He said it was all encrypted, and the only people that had the key to actually access kind of the exchange if something was up was a particular part of the government and not the whole government. And And he didn't mention anything about I think he said that the other phone generates some kind of random identifier that you're in contact with, and then there's some key created that only can be unlocked from the outside. So we might need to get some experts on to kind of dig into some of that detail with us.
And actually, just to chime in quickly on that point, that's actually one of the concerns I have with one of the leading proposals for New Zealand as well, which is the COVID card. And that's a little card that you would carry around that has a Bluetooth chip built in and connects with other cards, etc. At the end of the day, if the solution that's being used is involving a central database of phone numbers, which everything I've read about the COVID card indicates that there would be, it does make me a little nervous to even give the keys to the kingdom to the government. Like, anyone with a central repository of all of this data of Bluetooth random identifier to phone number or address or who that person is starts to have a very large incentive to use that outside of the realm of COVID. So again, I think it's something that we need to continue to explore both in this episode and future episodes. And hopefully we can get to the bottom of exactly how all of these systems protect privacy or don't.
Yeah, and I think more and more trust needs to be added to our slide, because there's a spectrum of society that will trust a big tech company, another one, others that won't. Some will trust the government, others won't. Some will trust like a niche provider, others won't. And that is going to have a big impact on what gets adopted by whom and at what scale. It reminds me that contact tracing, those numbers remind me of digital television in the 2000s rolling out in the UK. It was like the first million was kind of easy, and then it just gets harder and harder. And if you want to get to 10 million, and and it's all out there, and anyone who's ever kind of going to download it has downloaded it. How do you get the next 6 million? It could be an incredibly uphill battle to get that next batch without some sort of incentive. The other thing that I heard in that document, that podcast, was around the mandatory versus non-mandatory. And it's completely voluntary, isn't it, Brian?
It is in Australia, yes.
Yeah, which is another thing.
Sort of diffusion of adoption curve, won't it? Where you get the early adopters take things on straight away, and you get then the others who follow on a little bit later. But then you get this long tail of adoption that takes years and years and years before you get really high rates.
Yeah, we don't really have years and years and years, do we? We want actually something that wraps around the planet quite quickly because people believe in it. So let's talk now about Bluetooth and this idea that if you are, so it's, as I understand it, it's completely blind to location. So it doesn't know where you were. It just knows that you've spent 15 minutes near somebody in Bluetooth range.
Yep.
With the app, I think needs to be open. Is that, am I right on that? It actually needs to be open.
They've not communicated that very clearly. The app itself says it needs to be open in power saver mode. Now, power saver mode is not a common term that I've heard in my iPhone apps. I understand that so long as it's running in the background, but then there's also settings in my phone for background app refresh, and they don't say anything about that. I assume that doesn't need to be on. Bluetooth needs to be on, they tell you that. So if you wanted to stop it from working for some reason, you could close the app, I guess. You can turn your Bluetooth off. If you wanted to do something where you didn't want to be traced. But the bottom line, and I didn't mention this earlier, as I understand it, the sequence of events is somebody gets infected, they upload their data to the Department of Health on request by explicitly tapping a button in their app, and then the Department of Health may contact me and say, our information indicates that you've been in contact or close to somebody who has tested positive. Come in and get tested. Now, I can't really see any reason that I would desperately want to know if I've been in contact with somebody who's positive, so that I can protect myself and protect my family from not passing it on to them. So it seems to me that's just a, sorry, that was a little off topic, Simon, but came to mind. I think it's worth mentioning.
Well, and I can maybe chime in really quickly. So basically, there are different rules for Android phones versus iPhones, but the general idea here is if you've opened the app and it now has switched into background, so you're not like actively using it for at least a certain period of time, and it's different for Android versus iPhone, but like it will keep letting the app service the Bluetooth stack. It'll keep letting it wake up, and I think it's every 15 seconds or so, it does a polling process to try to identify everything else that's in the area. The thing that's a little bit tricky here is if people aren't well versed with their phone, if people are just used to, say, always force killing their iPhone tabs when they're done with them, they're going to like basically accidentally end up without valid contact tracing. So like there are some edge cases that I think we need to think through and figure out whether that actually always makes sense. But in general, like I agree with you completely, Brian, that like a solution that gives me protection, gives me peace of mind, I'm definitely going to use. The only scary thing is one of the great articles Simon sent me that I think was written by the professor at Otago that we had been conversing about, and maybe we can revisit that later. It showed a graph of basically how many % of people are using the app versus how many % of your contacts are actually being contact traced. And the scary thing is the graph is definitely a curve where if 100% of people have the app, then close to 100% of your contacts are traced. But if only 20 or 30% of the people have the app, then like less than 10% of your contacts are traced. So like you're saying, Brian, I think it's very important to get the word out that like, if we're going to have this work, everyone basically needs to opt in. And unless 60 to 80% of people opt in, we're not going to really have real efficacy in these solutions.
Yeah, and do we end up in a fatigue situation where, like, in 3 months they go, "Oh, look, we've now got a new app out. This one will do it better, and it'll complement the other one. But try and run both, or try and run this new one now." Like, it's interesting that they've gone out quite quickly, it seems, compared to other nations, with all guns blazing. Put it on the phone if you want. This is the way forward. Now I want to bring in all the way from San Francisco, a very good friend, Titus. Come on in. Oh, there we go. Ryan and I are playing tag. We're both switching you in and out.
Great.
Welcome, Titus.
Hi. Great to meet you.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about what America has in store for us in a minute, but
we're that uncle who doesn't wash his hands. That's how we are. We all know the one.
Yeah. Well, why don't we just get your comments on what you've been listening to so far, and you've heard a little bit about the Australian solution. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, the Australian solution, very similar to the Singaporean solution, I think, is what I've heard. And what's really interesting is, I think Australia at least has something, which is fantastic. America has both nothing and lots of them. So in my feed, I was just looking. There are about 15 different companies who've all emailed me proposals for tracking apps. There's actually one, my friend Misha Benoit actually has launched, which is actually pretty great, pretty secure, called the Coalition app, but it's only on Android. So for the 50% of people who have iPhone, that's not going to work. And then you have Palantir, Apple, and Google, just in case people were sleeping too well at night and needed somebody to keep them awake.
Yeah. So how would you feel if the Australian app was rolled out around America? Would it make you sleep at night, or would you just be like, well, that didn't do much?
Well, it's interesting. So my friend Mark Pesce, actually, in Australia, had mentioned the app, and I had mentioned all the sort of assurances, and I don't think America so far has given any assurances that any of this information we're giving for any of this relief. I know a friend of mine who's locked in a lawsuit with Treasury around Bitcoin is his PPP loan docs were given to the agent investigating him, because when you sign those PPP docs, you give permission for them to share that in the government. So I think anything that came top down at a federal level in the US, people are going to have real concern about why they would share that information with the government. I'm a bigger fan of the peer-to-peer sharing, where you opt in, you share in a very prescribed way, sort of like medical data today, so that can actually be used for a cure. But I think the Australian app still does capture quite a bit more data than you'd want and store it in an unknown, possibly secure way. And then it's forever, right? It's forever with people who are paying more attention to this than maybe your Google browsing history. Because I think that point is absolutely correct.
Great. Okay, Priya, anything?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to. Well, I mean, we want to counter that. Like, obviously, it makes a lot of sense. We need privacy, and America's really where they're going has been extremely concerning for me, because I read a bunch of stuff about virology, and there was a woman named Typhoid Mary. I don't know if anyone's familiar with her, but she was a cook she was an Irish cook, and she lived in New England and in New York City, and in Boston, I think, too. And she just refused to wash her hands, and she refused to wear a mask. And she was a reason why typhoid spread so quickly. And it was 40 years before antibiotics to cure typhoid. And so 3,000 babies used to die per week in New York City in the ER before some of these advances. And so it's like, we have to measure it with behavioral change. That, like, there's just, in America, it just seems to be a lot of not a lot of really critical thinking on either end of the privacy and also trying to keep people safe. It's been extremely concerning for me, especially because my father got a heart transplant last year, and so my family has already undergone a lot of behavioral change, and I'm a behavioral economist, and so I totally understand where the psychology comes from, this cognitive dissonance. But it's time to actually start talking about concrete steps that we can take that are both technologically advanced and increase privacy, but then also increase good behavior that protects our most vulnerable populations.
Thank you. So let's just bring in the slide for the Australian contact tracing, just to kind of wrap up on that as a kind of an example. So where do we all believe that how's it performing on these criteria? Is it low on the privacy scale?
I don't know, but from the reading I've done, it looks like it's medium. I'm going to defer to John, though, for his opinion.
Yeah, I'm going to say it feels medium, especially based on the fact that there's either the transmittal of your phone number or a centrally registered database somewhere where a server actually has the mapping from the random ID to your phone number. Right. There have been some solutions proposed that are basically perfect forward secrecy, where there's no information that's leaked from the person reporting their condition to the servers running it. It only basically uses a system that allows people to understand where their exposures were without divulging any private information. I think these are always a trade-off, though, so we'll look into that more as we kind of explore how the Australian app works, and also dive in and try to compare it a little bit more to the Apple and Google suggested implementations.
And efficacy?
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple of points about that. I think its efficacy is entirely dependent on its uptake. If we don't get sufficient numbers, and the government was talking about getting 40% uptake, but even that is probably a minimum before it becomes really effective. And the other thing that came out just a few days ago is, you would assume that the receiver of this data was able to use it. Well, apparently that is not the case, at least not the case yet. They've conceded just a few days ago that the jurisdictions aren't able to get access to the data. What that means is that the jurisdictions, we're a federation, a little like the USA. Each of the states and territories have their own departments of health. And I assume that means that those departments have not yet got set up with the necessary software tools to download and utilize the data.
I mean, I think the big thing about the efficacy is that it doesn't take 15 minutes for the virus to transmit. And it just seems insane to put it's the wrong solution for this virus, isn't it?
If you had a little bit more data, if you knew how long each contact had been around, that might be useful. But if you collected every contact that you'd passed in the street, you might risk overwhelming the departments of health. You know, these people who try and trace up the contacts. So there might be a bit of a balance there. But yeah, it did strike me also, Simon, as being a long period of time to be around somebody who's infected without necessarily being reported.
Okay, let's go back to the technology. What's the technology as a rating?
I'm going to just say feeling pretty medium here as well. I think it's good use of technology, which is incredibly important. The only place that I'm seeing that it falls short is the levels of encryption and the way that the encryption keys and the diagnosis keys are created and shared in the Apple Google ecosystem, which I think a lot of the states apps are going to end up utilizing. That is a little bit weaker than just doing a Bluetooth ID with a central database. So let's say middle of the road, maybe we'll give them a 5 out of 10 for that side of implementation. But again, coming back to the thing that I really think is important to keep in mind, this is more of, like Brian mentioned before, a system that's meant to make it easier to remember where you've been, who you've seen. It's supposed to be something that works well across the population. A solution that works, a solution that is done but not perfect in a lot of regards is better right now, as long as we are very mindful about the fact that we can't have a long-term risk factor that encroaches on personal privacies.
Okay. Actually, Ryan, just take that slide off. I'm just going to update it. Would you say we've got security theater at play here or not?
I can jump in a little bit there. It seems like it's an honest attempt to get something out there that works. So I wouldn't put it high on the security theater side of things. I think that the biggest challenge there, as Brian pointed out earlier, is if we don't go beyond 4 million people using the app, then it's not going to be terribly effective. We're still going to be in the 20 to 30% of contacts traced realm. But again, anything that helps people put their health and safety top of mind, makes them think where they're going. I don't think the Australian app gives people a false sense of security. It may just not be as effective as we need.
Okay, cool. I've just updated this, so I'll put it up here. You can see it.
I think
so. I just put a few scores there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the big issue here is adoption. And the thing that people always miss about the Chinese response is that not only is it required, it's mandatory, and the app identifies where you can go. I don't see anyone in America or Australia or New Zealand or really anywhere in the sort of West accepting those kinds of limits on their actions or behavior. But that is what it takes to take this all the way to zero. So we're going to have to compromise somewhere between these positions. And I do think the thing that terrifies me the most about the US profile, and speaking about the US, is we're not responding. I mean, Australia has an app, you can debate the app, but it's actually deployed and used, and some people can use it. In America, we have a couple of half-baked solutions that have been half announced, but no one's using them. A couple more driving for adoption with different conflicting standards. It feels like Windows software.
And also, it's just like a lot of disinformation, you know, that is flowing from other parts that are love watching us scramble like this. Like it makes them feel so happy that we would be in the situation that we're in, and we all have to remember that as well. Is that like, hey, you know, I'm okay with being a public person. I am on Facebook. I've been on Facebook since it started in my college, and you know, for that reason, I'm happy to be, you know, track myself a little bit so that I can actually get out of the house. We've been in beautiful New Zealand. We haven't left the house barely. I've been jump roping in the backyard to get my exercise. So it's just a reminder that we have to keep this. There has to be a balance there, and I think that if there's information that's accessible by agencies for any length of time that is not de-anonymized, and there's ways of using cryptography and de-anonymizing information so that we can actually pull and cull data. The data is what's important, so we can see trends about how people move and not about specific people. And I think it's really important that we you know, say that fear is very real. What you're highlighting, I just want to Titus, just like, you know, say like, yes, absolutely, that's definitely a concern that we have to be aware of when it comes to solutions in at least in America. I can definitely see that.
Yeah, so let's turn our minds to America. Thank you, Brian, for the breakdown on the Australian situation.
Just want to add one more point to that, please, Simon.
Yeah, sure.
The government here could scarcely have given this initiative more support. Every time the Prime Minister speaks, he mentions downloading the app. He's even said he's linked the uptake of the app to the reduction of restrictions. He's literally said, download the app if you want to go to the pub. We need to get more people downloading the app. It's been tremendously well supported. There's quite a big advertising campaign running on television. So it will be interesting to see. Short of making it mandatory, and I don't think that's really a starter, but short of making it mandatory, I don't know what else they can do. So it'll be interesting to watch how the numbers change over the coming weeks.
Yeah,
and actually,
there you go.
I think that's a really great point, that I think it's a non-starter to make it mandatory in either Australia or the US. And at the same time, that has an intrinsic challenge because we don't want people tracking where we're going, what we're doing. Information that is private should stay private. But at the same time, we also opt into sharing things like our location every day with, let's say, Facebook, Twitter, other places that you can go ahead and check in. Foursquare, I think, was one of the first apps that did that, or maybe Dodgeball, which was the first version of that the founders created. I don't know. I think that there's a challenge here where we very much need to respect personal privacies, but also, let's say tomorrow a company like Facebook or Google sets up a voluntary check-in application to let you track where you've been and whether there are clusters there. I don't know about everyone else, but I would choose to opt into that as long as I didn't have to check in.
Yeah, so let's look at the. I put up on screen, Ryan, the Australian. That's the kind of score I gave. Maybe simplicity needs to come up a bit because it is pretty simple, but it is a big display of confidence, isn't it? It's like it's a chance for the political leadership of the country to say we're doing something. We've got something here. Whether it's the most efficient and best method is really questionable. So let's go to you, Titus, to tell us the spectrum of things. And like, you've got all of these proposals for the niche solutions sitting in your inbox. How do you think it's going to play out?
Well, so I split my time between the U.S. and Canada. So, and I'm part of something called CDL, which is working on an accelerator stream called Recovery. So a few of these are related to that. I just want to be honest. However, I'll use the smallest example first. So as I mentioned before, my friend Misha has launched something called the Coalition app, which is Android only. He's already got Berkeley to sign up to use it in a city basis. So we've already, that thing I said earlier about regional rollouts is happening right now. Then you have Palantir, Facebook, and Google, all who've been awarded some level of engagement by both the federal and the state governments with no clear rollout plan and not really a clear strategy yet, although the technology underlying the data collection piece is interesting. Priya made a point that I think that we lost a little here. There's the data collection in aggregate to use, and using that with some sort of back office identification eventually that you are a person who had COVID, I think would upset Americans more, although to me it's a bit more insidious, versus the having the app and having it say bing, 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 you know, like red signal, I have COVID, you know, I have to show this to everyone. It's Logan's Run all over again, right? That's, I think, those are the two extremes of what's in people's heads. And I think it's going to end up being something a little bit softer, where we have a bunch of data we can go and retroactively search, or if you opt in, you get some benefit or some public good.
Or it's kind of like an Amber Alert, you know, like
exactly.
We all have volunteered for that. We've gotten them on our phones in various places. And, you know, to me, at first, when I saw my phone vibrating and it was, you know, 2 a.m. and it's an Amber Alert, of course, I got like panicked. So I was just like, oh my God, there's some kid who's in trouble. And then immediately was like, how can I be of service? And I think that it appeals to Americans, but we definitely are hyper aware with technology, the way that it's evolving, that we need to watch how this data is used. There's ways of doing it that don't require us to be able to track individuals necessarily and track them to their COVID, you know, them getting COVID, you know, the way that a doctor or hospital doesn't necessarily track when somebody's visited, or, you know, you have your own set of data, but there's ways of anonymizing that data so that experts, like health experts and policymakers and police, can actually be of help. And so we can identify when things are going wrong, and then when they're going right, we don't need to intervene.
Yeah, and I actually just chime in on that too. I think Titus brought up a great point that the 3 leading proposals in the States are basically being worked on by Apple, Google, and Palantir. It's a very interesting set of players there, because Palantir, I don't know how many people track, like a couple of my friends co-founded the company. I've followed them from day one. They do federated data search across multiple data sources for mostly government contracts in the United States. So what that basically means is, and I'm going to use an example that's not by any means sensitive. They were one of the companies that could show you which blocks in 2008 during the financial crisis, which blocks of Manhattan were responsible for certain insurance claims or certain types of insurance products, tranche by tranche, basically failing. So by taking a wide variety of data from many data sources, and we're talking everything from publicly available data to things that only the security apparatus has, Palantir's system is able to draw incredible correlations. So in one version of reality, as long as Palantir is doing a really good job anonymizing the data, building in strong access controls, that's something that is great technology for contact tracing. On the other side, it could also get very scary if all of a sudden your credit card records, your phone records, your internet activity is all going into a database that's mineable and searchable. I don't see the federal government wanting to give that up. And we've already had a lot of instances where, like you were saying, Titus, the PPP application for the Bitcoin company getting in front of their agent or whatever at the IRS or wherever else, the SEC, that type of risk is really real. If we have all of this data available, I don't really see it being stopped or being not used after COVID.
And, you know, I want to add in there that, like, again, it's behavioral change. Like, if you really want people to, like, the smartest people who are going to follow things like washing their hands to participate, you want to ensure that they are not going to be persecuted for participation. And I think that's enshrined at the center of being an American, and why I was, you know, so happy that my parents immigrated. But, like, at the same time, you know, there definitely is overreach all the time, and we have to be constantly on top of our you know, on top of it. I wish, like, you know, what does the ACLU saying about it? All this kind of stuff. I'd be really curious about what some of those lawyers that deal with startups and startup technology, what what they're kind of thinking about in constitutional rights. I mean, right now, for example, in an emergency like this, a lot of our rights don't apply. So when people are talking about this from a constitutional perspective, they're actually doing themselves a disservice, because it's not the Constitution has been already kind of pushed to the side because we're in a pandemic, right? Which is something that John and I had been discussing previous to this, and why we wanted to talk to you folks about this.
So how's the US, like you said, Richard, that there's the three big players, and then a slew of smaller ones. How do you think?
Well, it's interesting. It's a tsunami of smaller ones, which I find so odd. And it's almost like testing companies. Who knew there could be so many testing companies to do COVID tests? And then there's tracing apps, and they're all looking to raise a whole bunch of money. You can do it either as cash or a donation, so they can buy media to go advertise their solution. And it feels like we're about to see an arms race of tracing apps in the US.
Wow.
Which is crazy, right? And in Canada, they're rolling it out state by state. So Calgary's just launched something. I expect Toronto will launch something soon. We're telling you have a city. Berkeley, as we said before, has one. So it feels very discombobulated. And because we don't have I personally believe we should have a national CTO of the nation, and we don't have anyone like that to set standards and practices and technology stacks, so that as people are building too, they can have a common framework at least, or a common data set. Like as it is now, who knows if these things will even work?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's been such a struggle just to coordinate things like supplies, let alone actual, a federal kind of oversight of technology. Seems like it'll never happen with the government, right?
Well, so what will end up happening is people will do this on some sort of opt-in basis, and that data will be mostly garbage, and will be sort of munged on the back end by people like Palantir. Will probably get paid to do this work twice. They'll do it once at the state or regional levels, and then they'll get paid by the federal government to aggregate all the results they did for all the smaller tests, which actually is not a bad business strategy as I think about it.
Oh, it's a great business
just
strategy.
Kidding, just like watch tomorrow Palantir.
Wow, did I just actually reveal I'm not
yeah,
sure.
Damasco.
I actually know people there very clearly. Didn't read the memo. No. I know you accidentally sent it to me.
Actually, it's that times all the countries in the world, isn't it? Because then it becomes if it gets into that kind of that kind of the spy circles of
look, Cambridge Analytica is out of business, so there's no competition now at this point.
Yeah, someone's going to step right in, but they already did in Moscow. I mean, come on, that stuff is still real. I mean, I work for the state of Oregon in Congress, and I've been frontline to policy work in Washington D.C., but on finance, and I can just only imagine how disjointed this all has been, and especially for governors, it's probably the scariest thing ever. Oregon has been able to limit their a lot of their cases, but they had an emergency room physician, this guy named Kitzhaber, who was governor for a really long time, and he built a lot of this. And one of the senator's wives is a nurse, a neonatal nurse, and so they totally get kind of how some of this might go down. Governor Kate Brown has been awesome. I've been watching everything that's coming out of there, obviously really closely because of my dad's condition. And so I've been really impressed by what they're doing. California has been pretty amazing, despite the fact that, it's been such a fire there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably right. Actually, California in America is probably one of the best state responses because they were early to lock down. They've been sensible about the loosening of restrictions, and there's another loosening coming. I think at the app level or at the contact tracing, my guess is that the state is struggling to sort of figure out how that fits in a federal. I mean, America's the 5th largest economy in the world, so we could just kind of go it alone. But I think we're trying to delay the secession for a couple more years.
Yeah. Also, like America's kind of security imperatives, if Palantir are right in there to sort of wrap it all up at a at a national level for America, then they, the ties into the different economies of the world, and kind of like, well, this is what we're doing globally, and Palantir just ended up kind of being this kind of you got to make sure it plugs into Palantir.
It becomes the IBM of the 21st century. By the way, if you can hear that, that's the city of San Francisco cheering for the healthcare workers because it's 8 o'clock there. And it's quite loud, actually. So it's amazing every night. And it's become a neighbor versus neighbor now with foghorns and instruments. So I'm not
Should
sorry.
we take a moment of silence? Should we be quiet for a second and thank all of and snap for all of the healthcare workers front
my
line?
partner just texted me. They're mad they have to do it on the back patio tonight.
Oh, I love that tradition. I was actually my roommates. When I am based in San Francisco, they live up near Twin Peaks, and I was video chatting them. Clipper Terrace, if you know where that is.
Yeah.
But
it's about a block
so it's a small world. Anyway, last night I was video chatting them and catching up for a roommate sync, and I heard them cheering. It sounds like it's every day, which is, I think, an awesome tradition to have.
Every day, and I swear, I thought like 2 nights max this thing will fill. No, it's every night. It's loud. Instruments, vuvuzelas, if you know your South African history. There's obviously some South Africans somewhere in the neighborhood.
That's
really cool. Oh, yeah, we can hear it now. Yeah. The vuvuzela.
Okay. My daughter who's 18 months old, every time she looks at the patio now, she goes, woohoo!
Isn't it strange in a sense is actually bringing people together in our isolation?
Well, it's actually true. Like that 8 p.m., I look forward to it. It's like it's the bells ringing at the end of the day of the fields back in the medieval times. It's like it marks the passage of time and helps keep you sane. I think that what's interesting about the U.S. response on this app thing is I don't know that we'll ever get this at all. I think that we will be last, which is really unfortunate. And I don't know what exactly that means. I mean, I think there'll be lots of little pockets of data and that data will be poorly used. But at the macro level, to roll something out and get enough people to not to accept the safety of it is going to be really, really hard. And I think you'll get intermittent adoption in some communities, but I think that's almost worse because it gives people a false sense of confidence or safety.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's kind of like with Facebook, where we've gotten this small, as a behavioral economist, we talk about this. You get this really small window of seeing what everybody's doing on the internet, and then all of a sudden it's going to reverse because people are starting to wise up to, their fears.
Yeah, and just to kind of mention one of the things I've been thinking through, I had a conversation with one of my friends, a couple of them from back in my Facebook days, and a couple other projects that I've worked on. They now are working with the U.S. Digital Response, which is basically a volunteer organization that's trying to supplement the U.S. government's response, which has been basically non-existent. And one of the things that they've kind of talked me through is right now with the fragmentation, with all of the questions, Titus, I think you're exactly right that we will be the last to have a functioning app ecosystem that's interoperable and works on a national basis. And the scary thing that I've kind of been visiting and talking about is, what does that mean for our privacy? Because if we have a functioning app, if we have something that lets you create a personalized encrypted ledger on your phone, or something that lets you keep track of where you've been or who you've seen, I think it gives people a very strong tool when we do have to do manual contact tracing or when we otherwise need to go down that rabbit hole. But I worry that in a world of federal contractors, in a world of a lot of government apparatus that can spy on individuals, at some point, if we think that there isn't an effective solution available, then the powers that be start to look at all the solutions that they have that maybe aren't opt-in, and they start to look pretty desirable. So I think that's the thing we really do need to have a conversation about and focus on is how do we make sure that the existing tools or the available tools are strong enough that no one behind closed doors makes the argument that hey, we just have to suck in everyone's data with a huge vacuum cleaner, and we won't keep doing this after COVID. Everything's going to be fine because we all know how
we deleted that for sure. Just like last
Yeah.
time.
Trust us.
Maybe that's a good thing that will be the last, because we do have the kind of markets that we do. Like, you have so many people on Facebook, and then people have social security numbers and all kinds of things like that. It's probably a good thing if we take our time getting there, even though it might mean that people have to really change their behavior in terms of not spreading this disease.
But maybe it's a bit like, the early days of something like the internet or something, and there's different things popping up everywhere, but it's at some point one thing is just like the bee's knees, because there are people traveling all over the world. There'll be confusion, just people traveling, within one section of America, let alone going cross border, and people trying to figure out what they should be using. Because I was there last week and I've got all that data sitting on that app. Now I'm over here and you're telling me to use this app. Like, that's going to get messy quickly.
And I think that's a good time to chime in and just say one thing, which is the real takeaway that I want a lot of people to have from this is digital apps are only going to go so far. They're going to help us. They're going to be a tool. But if you have the choice to go outside with a responsible mask on, not necessarily an N95 mask, but whatever is going to reduce your chances of transmission, make sure that there's still PPE available for healthcare workers, but basically washing your hands, wearing a mask in public, coughing into your elbow, all of these things are really tangible things that will help a lot more than a digital contact tracing at reducing the spread of COVID. If we also have a digital contact tracing app above and beyond best practices, that's great. But we shouldn't think that there is a silver bullet in any of these solutions. We really want to be mindful of the fact that this is only going to help with existing good public practices and public health policies.
And I just want to add something in there, if viruses have, if we find out more about what the long-term implications of this virus are in bodies, we've, with SARS, there was a lot of lung scarring, and that led to other externalities in people's health. I think at those times, that's the onset of the pandemic will also peak at those moments where people will say, well, maybe we really need this, any kind of solution, and they may opt for the one that gives far too much information to government agencies around the world.
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's too early to kind of go into the American contact tracing. There's kind of to be continued discussion there. We will follow it, and every time there's an announcement, we've just heard that there's a Hong Kong application that's been released, and so our motto is that if we have someone from the country talking us through it, then we'll talk about the application in that country. So just thank you all for all of your time. I want to give you a chance to just kind of make a closing statement as we go around. Brian?
Sure. There's something just came to mind that I thought is worth mentioning. There's a couple of dimensions to this that we haven't touched on. One is we don't know how this is going to pan out in the long term. Everybody hopes that it's all going to be over in a year or so. But with viruses, the way they mutate, this might be a new flu, where you have a vaccine and the vaccine is effective for this year, but not for next year's strain. So every year people get vaccinated and it's partially effective and lots of people die from the flu. This seems to be a much worse sort of version of the flu. It may be something that is around for a long time and we have to cope with for forever. That's one possibility. And I think that as this wears on, it's going to have big impacts on the way we think about using apps and about the way we interact. And the other dimension that we didn't really go into very much is how the public's perception of all of this is going to change when we get a country like Australia or New Zealand where it's basically eliminated, but you get outbreaks here and outbreaks there, and how effectively we're able to contain those outbreaks. How many people die when there's an outbreak? Can you reduce the number of deaths because you're carrying an app in your phone? If you can, and everybody understands that, maybe that'll be some sort of tipping point where we do get close to 100% adoption.
Fantastic. Titus, send us out with your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think, I'm lucky and blessed to live in San Francisco, which per capita has one of the lowest infection and spread rates, and I'm really happy about that. Unfortunately, I also live in a country where we really have never had to wrestle with the battle between personal privacy and sort of group safety and security. We've never had a war fought on these shores. We've never really had to make some of the trade-offs that most countries have had to at some point in their life really deal with. And so I think there's an existential crisis happening here in the States of people really struggling with the individualism versus the collectivism. And I think it's frankly been a long time coming.
Great. Priya.
Yeah, when SARS happened in 2001, I was a teenager and I really, really wanted to study health. And I went deep on it to learn what it was. And at that time, a lot of scientists were talking about the emergence of other viruses that could be similar, but a global contagion. And since then I've gone into various other fields in technology, and what I'm seeing is that what we're learning is that we're one, that our only universal is our health. I had a professor once asked me if what's the common human language, and I said something like math or something, but really it's our health. And we're starting to see that, and being here in New Zealand versus in San Francisco or in Portland, where my family is, has been an incredible education for me to see where cooperation begins, and trust in your government and trust in the people around you, and what effect that has upon something like this. And yeah, this is the beginning of a new era for all of us to understand that we are absolutely connected, and there's really nowhere else we can go. So we have to find global solutions to problems that may seem individual and may just seem clustered, may just be a country. But we all need a group response that's based on good information, critical thinking. I can see critical thinking is going to be the most important feature of communities going forward. And I certainly hope people can come up with heuristics and systems that help other people make decisions, but don't make them for them, if that makes sense.
Thank you. John?
I mean, I'll be real quick. I think Brian and Titus and Priya have brought up a lot of the things that matter most in all of this. I'll just leave us on the fact that we really are in this together. Never before in my lifetime have we had a situation where my personal health, my family's personal health, all of the people that I care about in my life, whether they be friends, community, whatever else, they're really dependent on the actions of others. So how long lockdown goes on, whether it's effective, whether we have a second wave, all of these things depend on the R0 rating for COVID staying low in our communities. And if we get back up to a situation where we're having 2.5 infections for every person that has it, and that's only known infections, not even asymptomatic ones, then we're going to go down a path of going back into crisis mode. So really, a rising tide here lifts all ships. If we all have good policies, if we all take the best takeaways as far as how we can be healthy, how we can respect others' health, and how we can all not turn into the vector that Priya was talking about earlier, that's really where we get to a happy solution. And whether it's technology or whether it's just best personal practices, we are all in this to stay healthy together.
Awesome. Well, look, thank you so much. It's been a real privilege to share this show. Thank you, Richard. Titus, sorry, I keep calling you Richie. Thank you, Titus.
It is confusing.
In San Francisco, thank you, Brian, in Perth. Thank you from the Mountain Club here in Queenstown and Moonshot Studio, Priya and John. This show has been a couple of weeks in preparation. And it's really just been amazing to hear all the different viewpoints. And as we kick this around, I think the interoperability, I used to think of it more within one country and one territory. But I think when I heard from you, Titus, about the tsunami of applications coming out, like we're really going to live in a patchwork of contact tracing technologies for the foreseeable future. So we just have to get the right combinations and spread them as widely as we can around the world, I think.
Yeah, it's absolutely been a pleasure. It's really nice to join all of you for this.
Totally.
Yeah. Thank you.
Really
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Ryan, play us out. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back next week, same time. We're live, and we'll be hoping to catch some people from the Hong Kong experience, the Hong Kong new contact tracing app that's just been announced. And we will catch you then. Thanks very much. Goodbye.